close your eyes. Picture volcanic peaks rising from turquoise water, clouds clinging to summits like ancient ghosts. This is Liamwiga, fertile land, in the Taino language. The island Europeans would rename St. Kitts after some saint who never set foot here. Its twin, Nevis, stands across a narrow channel, both islands cradling stories that predate any European map. For thousands of years before Columbus got lost looking for India, these islands were home. Not empty, not waiting. Home. The Taino and Kalinago peoples built civilizations here. Agricultural systems, trade networks, spiritual practices, political structures. They had names for every ridge and reef. They had laws, art, astronomy, medicine. Then came 1493. Christopher Columbus sailed past, pointed at some land that wasn't his, and claimed it for Spain. Classic European behavior. See something beautiful, assume it's yours, write it down, call it discovery. What followed wasn't inevitable. It was chosen. Chosen violence, chosen greed, chosen erasure. But here's what the colonizers never understood. You can steal land, but you can't steal memory. You can burn villages, but you can't burn the human capacity for resistance. This is the story of St. Kitts and Nevis. Not the Paradise postcard version, but the real one. The one written in indigenous footpaths and maroon trails, in plantation ledgers and rebel drums, in survival and strategy and centuries of people refusing to disappear. The mountains remember everything. Before 1623, Liamwiga wasn't waiting for Thomas Warner to show up and settle it. The island was already settled, thanks. Taino communities had perfected canuco farming, raised mounds that prevented erosion, and maximized crop yields in tropical conditions. These weren't random dirt piles. They were engineered agricultural systems that worked with Caribbean rainfall patterns, soil composition, and crop rotation needs. Spanish friar Ramon Panay, writing in the 1490s after contact in Hispaniola, noted with barely concealed surprise that indigenous farmers govern their lands with notable skill. Shocking that people who'd lived here for centuries knew what they were doing. Daily life moved to rhythms Europeans couldn't hear. Smoke from communal kitchens drifted through villages where families gathered for evening meals. Children learned to read weather in cloud formations, to identify fish in shallow reefs, to navigate by stars their ancestors had named. Elders carved zemis, spiritual figures, from wood and stone, each one connecting the living to ancestors and natural forces. Women wove cotton into hammocks and clothing, using techniques passed down through generations. Men built canoes from single trees, vessels that could navigate open ocean swells and Caribbean storms. These weren't primitive survival tactics. This was sophisticated civilization with deep roots and long memory. The Kalinago, more maritime and mobile than their Taino neighbors, maintained strategic villages along coastal ridges where they could watch approaching ships. They built their homes with views of the horizon. They had to. By the early 1500s, Spanish ships were already prowling these waters, and the Kalinago had learned through bitter experience that pale sails often meant trouble. They shared information across islands about European movements, creating early warning networks that stretched from Trinidad to Puerto Rico. Trade routes connected the Lesser Antilles to the Greater Antilles like highways. Shell beads crafted in one island traveled hundreds of miles. Cassava bread, prepared using knowledge that prevented the root's natural toxicity, moved between communities. Tobacco, ceremonial and social, circulated through gift networks. Stories traveled too. Origin tales, practical knowledge, warnings about dangers. When Europeans later claimed they brought commerce to the region, the Kalinago probably would have laughed if the situation weren't so deadly. They'd been running sophisticated trade networks for generations, maintaining relationships across islands and navigating complex political alliances that Europeans couldn't begin to understand. One detail haunts the archives. In a 1510 Spanish account, an officer notes that the Caribs of Uali are fierce. Uali was the Kalinago name for Nevis. Fierce in this context meant they defended their homes. Imagine that. People not welcoming armed strangers who wanted their land. The Spanish framed self-defense as aggression, setting a precedent that would echo through centuries of colonial justification. For thousands of years, people lived here without needing permission from Madrid or London. They governed themselves, fed themselves, educated their children, honored their dead, and built futures. That fact alone undermines every colonial justification that followed. Christopher Columbus sailed past St. Kitts in November 1493 during his second voyage, spotted Nevis with its cloud-wrapped peak, and named it Nuestra Señora de las Nieves, Our Lady of the Snows. Snow in the Caribbean. The man was really committed to seeing what he wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. He didn't land, didn't need to. Just pointing at islands and renaming them apparently counted as claiming them for Spain. The Taino and Kalinago people already living there weren't consulted about this name change or territorial claim. Shockingly, nobody asked if they minded having their homeland renamed after European weather patterns and Catholic saints. For the next century, European ships drifted through intermittently, Spanish, French, English, Dutch, all surveying, all taking notes, all writing reports back home about uninhabited islands that were demonstrably inhabited. A 1568 French account describes natives of fierce disposition on St. Kitts, which translated from colonial speak means. The Kalinago weren't rolling out welcome mats for armed foreigners who showed up uninvited. The Kalinago strategy during this period was sophisticated. They traded selectively with Europeans, maintaining diplomatic relations while keeping careful watch. They knew what had happened to indigenous populations in Hispaniola and Puerto Rico: disease, enslavement, genocide. They weren't naive about European intentions. By 1623, England decided it wanted in. Sir Thomas Warner arrived on St. Kitts with a small group of settlers and did something grimly efficient. He negotiated with the Kalinago leader Tegraman, promising coexistence and mutual benefit, while simultaneously writing letters to London describing how profitable the island would be once cleared of obstacles. The obstacles were people. The Kalinago weren't fooled for long. They'd watched European behavior across the Caribbean for over a century. They understood the pattern: negotiate, settle, expand, dominate. But Warner presented himself as different, reasonable, interested in peaceful cohabitation. Classic colonial diplomacy: smile while sharpening knives behind your back. In 1625, France joined England on St. Kitts, and suddenly the island hosted two rival European powers who fought each other constantly, but agreed on exactly one thing: the Kalinago had to go. The indigenous presence was incompatible with plantation ambitions. The following year, in 1626, French and English forces coordinated an attack on the Kalinago settlement. Father Boughton, a French priest, documented what followed: a massacre that killed hundreds of Kalinago people in a single night of coordinated violence. Survivors fled to neighboring islands like Dominica or retreated into the mountains where pursuit was difficult. The site where it happened became known as Bloody Point. Europeans didn't bother hiding what they'd done. They named the place after their violence like it was an achievement worth commemorating. Cleared was the word Warner used. Not conquered, not stolen, cleared, as if people were weeds cluttering desirable property. Sugar arrived in the 1640s, and everything that came before looks almost quaint by comparison. Tobacco had been the cash crop initially, profitable enough to sustain small colonial outposts. But sugar was different. Sugar was empire in crystal form, backbreaking to grow, expensive to process, insanely profitable to sell, and run entirely on enslaved labor. St. Kitts's volcanic soil, rich in minerals and reliable rainfall, made it perfect for sugarcane cultivation. English planters wrote home with barely contained glee about the possibilities. One 1654 letter describes profits greatly exceeding expectations, which is colonial code for, "We're getting obscenely rich off human suffering and the weather is nice." Enslaved Africans began arriving in larger numbers through the transatlantic slave trade. Igbo, Akan, Congolese, Yoruba, and dozens of other ethnic groups, forcibly taken from West and Central Africa, surviving the Middle Passage that killed millions, and sold in Caribbean markets like furniture at auction. A 1676 plantation inventory from St. Kitts lists the assets casually: 48 Negroes, 4 horses, 72 cattle. People ranked below livestock in the accounting ledger. That's not accidental phrasing. That's ideology embedded in bookkeeping, a worldview that required seeing humans as property to function without psychological collapse. Daily life on sugar plantations was industrial violence operating on a schedule. Days started before sunrise when the conch shell or bell summoned workers to the fields. The work was relentless, planting new cane, weeding between rows in brutal heat, cutting mature cane with machetes, hauling tons of stalks to grinding mills, feeding the mills that crushed cane into juice, boiling that juice in massive copper kettles over roaring fires, ladling the thickening syrup between pots until it crystallized. Sugar production ran on brutality, maintained by the whip and the threat of worse. Enslaved workers were whipped for working too slowly, whipped for talking back, whipped for resisting assault, whipped for existing in ways that annoyed overseers who held complete power over their bodies. Planter Samuel Martin, writing in his 1750s journal published later as Essay upon Plantership, describes punishment protocols with the emotional investment of someone organizing a filing system. He doesn't question the system's morality. He's annoyed that it requires so much management to keep people working against their will. But here's the thing the planters never quite grasped. People don't become objects just because you treat them like objects. Humanity persists even under systems designed to crush it. Resistance began immediately. Tools broke mysteriously at crucial moments in the harvest. Fires started in cane fields at inconvenient times, destroying weeks of potential profit. In 1688, an overseer complains in writing that the Negroes feign sickness with notable talent, and he cannot determine real illness from deception. Translation: enslaved workers were strategically disrupting production, and he couldn't prove it was deliberate. They were too skilled at it. Spoiler: it was definitely deliberate. Nevis exploded economically in the mid-1600s. Smaller than St. Kitts, but blessed with equally fertile volcanic soil and reliable trade winds, the island became covered in sugar estates that transformed its entire landscape. By 1700, Nevis was one of the wealthiest spots in the British Caribbean, a fact that shows up in grand plantation houses with imported furniture and desperate enslaved labor in equal measure. Planter John Mellish wrote in his 1705 diary that Nevis was the jewel of the Leewards, a tiny island generating enormous wealth for absentee owners in London. Then, in the same entry, he complained about discipline issues among the enslaved population. Discipline issues. That's how he described people resisting their own enslavement, as if wanting freedom was a management problem solvable through better oversight. Enslaved workers on Nevis did something remarkable under impossible circumstances. They maintained networks across different estates. Family ties survived forced separations. When planters sold individuals to different owners, families found ways to stay in contact, visiting on Sundays, passing messages through trusted intermediaries, maintaining relationships that the system tried to sever. Cultural practices continued despite prohibitions. Scattered baptism records from the 1740s preserve names like Kwamina, Ya, and Kojo, African names that slipped through the cracks of European record-keeping, tiny rebellions against the erasure that renaming was meant to accomplish. At night, drums echoed across the island despite laws explicitly banning them. Planters knew those drums meant communication, organization, cultural continuity, everything they wanted to prevent. One 1710 colonial order specifically forbids the beating of drums after sunset, which tells you exactly how effective previous bans had been. If the law needed repeating, people were ignoring it successfully. Work stoppages happened, coordinated slowdowns that couldn't quite be proven as intentional resistance but damaged productivity nonetheless. Mysterious crop failures that planters blamed on weather, but workers knew had other causes. Planters wrote constantly about insolence and insubordination, never quite connecting that maybe people didn't enjoy being property. Nevis also became a major market hub. Charlestown and the surrounding villages bustled with enslaved people hired out by owners, sailors from trading ships, free people of color who'd purchased their freedom or been manumitted, and traders moving between islands. Information traveled through these networks faster than official colonial mail. News of rebellions in Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, and beyond filtered through conversations in markets and docks, whispered in kitchens and passed along in the fields. The system was designed for total control, but control kept slipping through human connection. Starting in the 1660s, enslaved Africans began escaping into the mountains of St. Kitts. These weren't panicked flights made in desperation. These were calculated decisions, often carefully planned over weeks or months, sometimes involving multiple people from the same estate coordinating their departures. The British called them runaways. That's a neat little linguistic trick. Makes it sound like they were fleeing from something rather than running toward freedom. Frames escape as loss of control rather than assertion of agency. Maroon communities in St. Kitts never reached the size or fame of those in Jamaica's Blue Mountains or Suriname's interior forests. But they existed, and they were strategically sharp. An English military report from 1682 grumbles that the runaways have the advantage of the woodlands, and our men are at a loss in pursuit. Translation: British soldiers, weighed down with European equipment and colonial arrogance, couldn't keep pace with people who knew every trail, ravine, and water source. St. Kitts's mountains, while not as extensive as Jamaica's, offered enough terrain complexity to make pursuit dangerous and often futile. Maroons built temporary camps that could be abandoned quickly, maintained lookout positions that gave early warning of approaching soldiers, and used the dense vegetation as both concealment and defensive advantage. Maroons raided plantations, not randomly but strategically. They took food supplies, tools that could be used as weapons or for building, and sometimes weapons themselves. Occasionally, they liberated other enslaved people, particularly family members or those with useful skills. These raids weren't just about survival, they were psychological warfare, reminding planters that their control had geographic limits. What's remarkable is what Maroons preserved in these mountain refuges: African spiritual practices that blended traditional beliefs with practical survival knowledge. Herbal medicine using Caribbean plants identified through systematic experimentation, naming traditions that maintained ethnic identity, kinship structures that created community where isolation was the goal. The mountains became cultural sanctuaries where European power stopped at the forest line. No extensive written records exist from the Maroons themselves. They didn't exactly keep archives British soldiers could find and use against them. But oral traditions preserved in later generations and scattered testimonies from the 18th and 19th centuries describe communities with leadership structures, defensive strategies, and long-term sustainability plans. One fragment survives from a 1690 colonial council meeting where officials discuss the Maroon problem. The runaways grow bold and are become a considerable nuisance to the plantations. Nuisance. That's what they called people who refused to be enslaved, who chose freedom over security, who risked everything for autonomy. History calls them something else: the beginning of freedom. The Codrington family dominated St. Kitts's plantation economy by the 1690s, running estates as massive commercial enterprises. Christopher Codrington, writing in 1701, complains about mutinous Negroes who refuse the labor accorded them. Mutinous is a fascinating word choice, as if enslaved people had signed a contract they were now violating, rather than being forced into unpaid labor under threat of violence. It reveals how completely planters had internalized the rightness of slavery. The Codringtons ran their estates like corporations, which makes sense because they essentially were corporations. Profit-driven operations with investors, managers, quarterly accounts, and systematic exploitation. Letters between family members discuss profit margins, crop yields, and Negro management, with the same tone modern executives use for quarterly earnings reports. Human beings appear as line items, but plantation ledgers tell a different story in their gaps and corrections. Names crossed out without explanation. Line items for medical treatment that don't specify injuries. Sudden spikes in discipline costs. Whips purchased, chains ordered, payments to blacksmiths for iron restraints. Various sizes. They needed various sizes. Think about that. Children, women, men, all requiring different-sized shackles. One 1698 account notes payment to a blacksmith for iron restraints, various sizes, repair of same, and new locks for punishment cells. The casual bureaucratic language can't hide what it's describing: an infrastructure of control requiring constant maintenance. Resistance escalated throughout this period. Overseers increasingly reported work refusals, tool sabotage, coordinated slowdowns that couldn't be traced to specific individuals. Violence increased in both directions. Planters became more brutal in punishment, enslaved workers more defiant in resistance. The system required constant reinforcement because it was constantly being undermined. Oral histories, collected in 19th century documents by ministers and colonial officials, mention a woman known only as Mimba, remembered for refusing to kneel during a punishment ritual. The overseer ordered her to kneel for whipping, as was customary. She refused. He repeated the order. She stood. In the end, they had to whip her standing, and according to the story passed down, she never made a sound. Her name doesn't appear in British records. They didn't document resistance that didn't serve their narrative of control. But the memory survived anyway, passed through generations until someone finally wrote it down. Resistance doesn't need official documentation to be real. Sometimes the most important histories live in whispers, preserved by people who understood that memory itself was rebellion. Between 1760 and 1804, the Caribbean transformed from profitable colonial investment to existential threat for European empires. Tacky's revolt exploded across Jamaica in 1760, led by enslaved Africans who nearly drove the British from the island. The Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791, and by 1804, enslaved people had defeated French, Spanish, and British forces to establish the first Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere, proving that slave rebellion could succeed at scale. St. Kitts and Nevis, tiny islands with long mountains and isolated plantations, felt every tremor of these revolutions. Governor Woodley wrote nervously in 1792, "The slaves speak too freely of the news from Saint-Domingue." Saint-Domingue was Haiti's colonial name. Too freely meant they were discussing revolution openly, not bothering to hide their interest in events where enslaved people had risen against masters and won. Information networks among enslaved people were extraordinarily efficient, moving news faster than official channels. Sailors carried stories between islands, embellishing victories and minimizing defeats. Free people of color, who occupied an ambiguous position in colonial society with limited rights, but more mobility than the enslaved, traded information in markets and taverns. Social networks transmitted updates through field conversations, kitchen gatherings, and Sunday market assemblies where people from different estates mixed. A Nevis planter's diary entry from 1795 records him overhearing a conversation between enslaved workers. "I heard them speak of the Negroes of Hispaniola who have humbled their masters. He calls it dangerous talk and worries about the poison of such ideas spreading." From his perspective, it was dangerous. The idea that enslaved people could successfully overthrow the system threatened everything he owned. From the perspective of enslaved people listening to those stories, it was something else entirely. It was hope. Planters responded by tightening controls across the islands. Stricter curfews limited nighttime movement. Harsher punishments targeted those caught organizing or spreading information. Increased surveillance made gatherings suspicious. Colonial legislatures passed laws limiting public assemblies, banning drums and musical instruments that could carry messages, restricting movement between estates. The more they tried to contain information, the clearer it became that they were terrified. One detail stands out. In 1800, a St. Kitts estate owner writes to London requesting additional troops, noting that "the Negroes have grown bold in their manners and speech, and I fear the contagion from Saint-Domingue has spread here." Boldness. That's what freedom looks like to people who profit from oppression. The fact that enslaved people spoke confidently, looked overseers in the eye, carried themselves with dignity. These became threats worth reporting to colonial authorities. Ideas travel faster than ships, and fear travels faster than both. On August 1, 1834, slavery was officially abolished across the British Empire. Cannons fired in celebration. Speeches were given in London. British abolitionists congratulated themselves on their moral progress. Then came the fine print. The apprenticeship system required formerly enslaved people to continue working for their former masters, unpaid, for up to 6 more years, depending on whether they'd been classified as field workers or domestic workers. British officials called it a civilizing transition period, as if freedom needed training wheels and formerly enslaved people had to learn how to be free gradually. Everyone else called it what it was: slavery with better public relations and new legal language. On St. Kitts, an 1836 colonial report complains that apprentices show insolence by leaving fields early when they considered their daily task complete, challenging overseer authority in ways that would have been unthinkable under slavery, and demanding actual wages for their labor. The audacity of wanting compensation for work. the audacity of asserting any rights at all. Apprentices weren't fooled by the terminology. They knew slavery when they experienced it, regardless of what Parliament called it. Resistance continued through the apprenticeship period. Work slowdowns, legal challenges filed with magistrates, public complaints that made British abolitionists uncomfortable. One woman, Bessie Bryan, gave testimony in 1838 describing overseers who continued flogging apprentices illegally, using the same punishments that were supposed to have ended with emancipation. Her statement, preserved in Abolition Society records, helped fuel public pressure that ended apprenticeship early across the British Caribbean. On August 1, 1838, full legal emancipation finally arrived. 4 years late, but it arrived. The British framed abolition as moral progress, conveniently forgetting they'd run the slave trade for centuries and were now compensating slaveholders, not the enslaved, for their economic losses. The British government paid out £20 million to former slaveholders, an enormous sum financed through bonds that British taxpayers only finished paying off in 2015. Former enslavers received government payments for losing their property. Formerly enslaved people received freedom, immediate debts for any tools or housing they'd been using, and no land, no capital, no compensation for centuries of stolen labor. Still, August 1, 1838 mattered. It marked a legal transformation even as economic oppression continued through wage labor that barely sustained life. Slavery ended. The plantations did not. When formerly enslaved workers refused to work for starvation wages that barely differed from their conditions under slavery, planters looked elsewhere for exploitable labor they could control more effectively. From the 1850s onward, indentured laborers arrived in St. Kitts and Nevis, primarily from India, with smaller numbers from Portuguese Madeira and China. The indenture system promised contracts specifying terms, wages that sounded reasonable on paper, and return passage home after the contract period. On paper, it looked different from slavery. In practice, it wasn't different enough to matter for workers' daily lives. Contracts were written in English, which many indentured workers from India couldn't read, and verbal promises made by recruiters in Calcutta or Madras often contradicted written terms. Wages were paid in plantation scrip, currency usable only at plantation stores where prices were inflated and choices were limited. Debts accumulated mysteriously through charges for housing, food, medical care, and various fees. Magistrates who were supposed to protect workers' rights and enforce contract terms consistently sided with planters in disputes, maintaining the power imbalance. One 1872 plantation record from St. Kitts includes a note from overseer John Thorne. The coolies keep to themselves and hold strange festivals in their quarters. Coolies was the derogatory term British colonials used for Indo-Caribbean workers. Strange festivals referred to Hindu religious practices, Diwali celebrations, Phagwa observances, that persisted despite regulations limiting gatherings and discouraging non-Christian worship. Cultural survival continued, even under surveillance. Indenture reshaped Caribbean demographics permanently. Indian cuisine with its curries and roti, festivals celebrating Hindu and Muslim traditions, and family structures that maintained ties to distant villages in India wove into the regional fabric. But the plantation system remained fundamentally exploitative regardless of who it was exploiting, maintaining the same power dynamics that had existed under slavery. The fundamental equation never changed. Labor conditions designed to extract maximum profit while providing minimum dignity, backed by legal structures that protected owners over workers. By 1896, economic depression had crushed St. Kitts. Global sugar prices collapsed as European beet sugar production expanded. Planters cut wages to maintain their profit margins. Workers, already living at subsistence level, faced starvation. On a humid afternoon that year, anger that had been building for months exploded. Workers rioted in Basseterre, targeting estate offices where ledgers documented their debts and colonial administration buildings that represented British authority. They weren't demanding luxury, just enough to eat, just fair wages for backbreaking labor, just basic human dignity that the system refused to provide. British authorities panicked immediately. Emergency orders went out from the governor's office. Troops were requested from Antigua to suppress what officials called dangerous disturbances in their reports to London. Police reports name several leaders, including Joseph Liebert, a laborer accused of inciting workers to violence and disturbing the public peace. Liebert's words in court, recorded by a court stenographer and preserved in newspaper accounts, are simple and devastating. "We want bread." 3 words. Simple, human, unanswerable. The riots were suppressed through military force. Dozens were arrested and sentenced to hard labor. But the colonial government was visibly shaken by how quickly order had collapsed. Worker consciousness had reached a breaking point where fear of punishment couldn't contain desperation. Wages were eventually raised, slightly, marginally, just enough to prevent immediate revolt, not enough to fundamentally change conditions. But the message was clear. The system would only change when forced to change through collective action that threatened stability. The 1896 riots proved that organization and collective action could shake even entrenched colonial power. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the sound of walls beginning to crack under pressure. The global depression of the 1930s hit the Caribbean like a hurricane, devastating economies built on single export crops. Sugar prices collapsed globally. Planters across the region refused wage increases despite rising food costs. Workers throughout the Caribbean, from Trinidad to Jamaica to St. Kitts, reached the breaking point simultaneously, creating a regional crisis. On January 28, 1935, laborers marched through Basseterre demanding better pay and working conditions that recognized their humanity. Thousands gathered in the streets. Police confronted them. Someone gave an order. Gunfire erupted into the crowd. The violence spread across the island as workers struck back against decades of systematic exploitation. Colonial authorities declared emergency measures and imposed curfews. British officials wrote alarmed letters about the dangerous mood among laborers, as if starvation wages should be quietly accepted without complaint. Thomas Manchester, a labor organizer who would later become a national hero, documented the brutality in newspaper columns that circulated throughout the Leewards. His writing was sharp, factual, and devastating. He didn't need to editorialize much. The facts were damning enough. He documented police violence, listed workers' modest demands, and exposed the vast wealth gap between planters and laborers. The 1935 riots gave birth to organized labor movements. The St. Kitts Workers' League formed shortly after, creating institutional structures for workers' political power. For the first time, the plantation majority had formal representation and a voice in political discussions that had previously excluded them entirely. Britain responded with minor reforms, wage increases that barely kept pace with inflation, labor protections that existed mostly on paper, oversight mechanisms that changed little. Classic imperial strategy: contain the explosion without addressing the underlying conditions that caused it. But something irreversible had happened. Workers had organized, fought collectively, and won concrete concessions. They'd proven that collective action worked and that organized labor could force the colonial government to negotiate. The colonial system was still in place, but it was now negotiating with people it had previously just controlled. Between 1958 and 1962, St. Kitts Nevis Anguilla joined the West Indies Federation, an ambitious attempt to unite British Caribbean colonies into a single independent nation with shared governance. Meetings happened in Port of Spain, Trinidad. Speeches were given about Caribbean unity and shared destiny. Committees formed to address economic integration and political structure. It was complicated. Jamaica and Trinidad, the Federation's largest members by population and economic power, dominated discussions and decision-making. Smaller islands felt sidelined, their concerns dismissed as provincial compared to regional priorities. Britain dragged its feet on granting real power to the federal government, maintaining control over key areas like defense and foreign policy. Economic integration plans stalled over competing interests. Political tensions escalated between island leaders with different visions. Then Jamaica held a referendum in 1961 and voted to leave the Federation. Trinidad followed shortly after. By 1962, the Federation collapsed entirely, barely 4 years old, a noble experiment that couldn't overcome the centrifugal forces of island identity and competing economic interests. Meanwhile, within the tri-island colony of St. Kitts Nevis Anguilla, internal tensions simmered. Nevis had always maintained distinct identity and political structures separate from St. Kitts, and many Nevisians resented Basseterre's administrative dominance over island affairs. Anguilla, smallest and most isolated, felt doubly marginalized, ignored by both St. Kitts and the broader Federation. In 1967, Anguilla rebelled, not against Britain, but against being governed from St. Kitts without adequate representation. They expelled the local police force and declared effective independence from the associated state arrangement. Britain, embarrassed by a tiny island defying colonial arrangements, sent troops and officials in 1969 to restore order in what became known mockingly as the Bay of Piglets, a tiny invasion that was somehow both deadly serious and absurd in its disproportion. This era was messy, frustrating, and deeply human. People were trying to shape political futures after centuries of having futures shaped for them by distant colonial administrators. There were no clean answers, no perfect solutions, just negotiations and compromises and competing visions of what independence should mean. Independence wasn't a gift bestowed by benevolent colonizers. It was a negotiation, a struggle, a process of figuring out what freedom actually meant in practical terms. September 19, 1983. St. Kitts and Nevis became an independent nation within the Commonwealth. Flags rose over new parliament buildings in Basseterre. The national anthem, O Land of Beauty, played for the first time as the official song of a sovereign nation. Drums echoed across Basseterre, the same rhythms that once had to hide in mountain forests under slavery, now broadcast openly in celebration. The transition was constitutional, peaceful, negotiated over years of discussion between local leaders and British officials. After 360 years of colonial rule stretching back to 1623, the islands finally chose sovereignty and self-determination. Nevis maintained its own island assembly and constitutional right to secede through referendum, a reminder that even within independence, questions of identity and governance remained complicated. The Constitution recognized Nevisian autonomy as essential to the Federation's legitimacy. Colonial boundaries drawn by European powers don't automatically match lived community identity. Independence didn't erase history or solve all problems. Sugar mills still dot the landscape. Picturesque ruins now. Tourist attractions photographed by visitors who rarely learn the full story. The violence embedded in those stones, the lives ground down in those grinding wheels, gets conveniently forgotten in favor of Caribbean charm. The economic legacy of plantation agriculture persists in land ownership patterns, regional inequalities, and structures that still concentrate wealth. But something fundamental shifted in 1983. Political power, for the first time in recorded history, resided within the islands rather than being imposed from London. Decisions about education, economy, law, and culture would be made locally. Mistakes made after independence would be local mistakes, not colonial ones imposed from abroad. That matters. Mount Liamuiga still rises above everything, its slopes holding centuries of memory in their ridges and valleys. Indigenous villages where Taino families once farmed in sophisticated agricultural systems. Mountain passes where Maroons built freedom away from plantation control. Plantation fields where enslaved workers resisted through countless small acts of defiance. Trails where workers marched for dignity and fair wages. The wind moves through trees that survived colonization's axes, rustling leaves that have witnessed generations of struggle. Below the Caribbean Sea glitters infinite and patient. The same waters that carried slave ships and freedom seekers, colonial navies, and rebellious sailors. A single drum sounds in the distance, the same heartbeat that survived Middle Passage ships, the same rhythm Maroons used to signal safety or danger, the same pulse stitched through Kittitian and Nevisian culture today in music and celebration. The Caribbean is not a story of conquest. It is a story of resistance, continuous, creative, unfinished. The islands remember. They're still speaking. And anyone willing to listen can hear centuries of refusal to disappear, echoing from the mountains to the sea.